Welcome to Backroom, where gangster stories meet calm sleep. Here, we share the quieter side of history, the dreams and lives behind the legends, told softly to help you drift into peace. Tell us where you're listening from, and one good thing about your day. If you enjoy the stories, like and subscribe. Your support keeps these midnight tales alive. Now close your eyes and let the night take over. The city of Guadalajara in the mid-1980s was alive in ways that could deceive a stranger. If you walked its streets at night, you might believe it to be a place of celebration and charm. A city where music spilled from cantinas and neon signs painted bright reflections across the rain-darkened pavement. Lovers strolled hand in hand beneath the glow of street lamps. The air carried the smell of roasted corn, cheap cigarettes, and perfume drifting from open doorways. At first glance, it was vibrant, magnetic, yet behind the music and the laughter, there lingered a silence too heavy to ignore. The kind of silence that belonged to fear. Whispers lived in the corners of smoky bars. Whispers of men who had grown richer than anyone dared to imagine. Men whose shadows stretched across Mexico, and among them one name traveled with particular weight. Rafael Caro Quintero. To most he was just a rumor, a story traded between glasses of tequila, a man glimpsed from the corner of an eye, but never approached directly. Yet for those who knew him more, thought they did, he was far more than that. He was charm and menace woven together. He was the figure who could silence a room simply by walking into it. On such a night, the streets themselves seemed to bend toward him. Caro Quintero was young then, handsome in a way that disarmed as much as it unsettled. His suits were perfectly cut, his smile both generous and calculated. When he entered a club, the music seemed to fall softer, conversations lowered, and eyes followed as if the very air acknowledged his arrival. He carried with him a reputation, the man who had risen from the poor soil of Sinaloa to carve out a place in the very heart of Guadalajara's underworld. But what made him most dangerous was not just his wealth or his rich, it was his audacity. In a city where many lived in shadows, Caro Quintero walked boldly through the light. He laughed loudly, spent lavishly, and showed a confidence that bordered on arrogance. It was this confidence that earned him the whispered title, El Narco de Narcos, the Narco of Narcos. It was more than a name. It was a crown, one that set him apart even among men who commanded fear. Yet beneath his polished surface lay something far more complex. He was not a man who drifted into power by accident. He was deliberate, strategic, and always aware of the impression he left behind. Those close to him described a figure who could be warm one moment and chillingly cold the next. He was the kind of man who, when he fixed his eyes on you, left you uncertain whether you had been given a blessing or marked for ruin. Guadalajara, in those days, was not merely a city of music and light. It was the seat of an empire. Behind the facades of haciendas and the tinted windows of luxury cars, the Guadalajara Cartel had taken root. Airstrips carved into remote landscapes carried goods northward, and rivers of money flowed back south. The men who ruled this empire were architects of something vast, something that reached beyond borders. And Caro Quintero, with his charisma and cunning, was one of its brightest and most volatile stars. But the city itself bore the weight of this presence. Shopkeepers smiled too quickly, policemen looked away too often, and ordinary citizens carried a quiet dread in their steps. Everyone knew that beneath the songs of the mariachis and the chatter of the markets, there was another rhythm pulsing through Guadalajara, rhythm of power, fear, and inevitability. It is here, in this uneasy balance, that our story begins. Imagine the scene: a quiet bar tucked away on a side street, the air dense with cigar smoke. A jukebox hums in the corner, playing a mournful ballad. At a table near the back, a man sits surrounded by friends and strangers alike. He is generous with his drink, his laughter filling the room, yet every gesture is calculated. This man is Rafael Caro Quintero, and though the bar is small, the atmosphere makes it feel as if the entire city leans in to listen. Somewhere in that laughter, in the clinking of glasses, lies a truth that would one day shock nations. For Caro Quintero was not simply a trafficker or a criminal. He was a symbol of something larger, something far more unsettling. He embodied the collision of two worlds: the quiet villages of Sinaloa, where he had once walked barefoot, and the polished halls of Guadalajara, where power was bought and sold like currency. In the glow of that night, it was easy to be captivated by the man. His confidence, his ease, his undeniable magnetism, all of it painted the picture of someone untouchable. Yet shadows followed him, and they grew longer with every passing hour, because power, no matter how bright, always carries with it the certainty of darkness. The question that hung unspoken in that smoky room and across the city itself was one that would soon define his legacy. How far could he go before the world demanded an answer? How long could he stand at the center of an empire before the walls began to close in? As the night wore on and the city hummed with restless energy, Caro Quintero leaned back in his chair, a glass in his hand, a smile on his lips. To the casual observer, he looked like a man at peace, a man who had conquered his world. Yet history would prove otherwise. For, beyond the neon lights and the laughter, forces were already moving. Agents were watching, governments were waiting, and somewhere, fate had already begun to write the end of his story. But on that night, in Guadalajara, none of that was visible. There was only the music, the neon, the whispers, and the presence of a man whose name would echo for decades to come. The story of Rafael Quintero cannot be told without first walking through the dust of Sinaloa, his birthplace, his beginning. But Irapuato was not a city of neon lights or polished streets. It was a land of sharp ridges and endless valleys, where the sun pressed down without mercy and the earth yielded little to those who tilled it. To be born here was to know the taste of struggle before you even knew the word for it. The air carried the smell of burning wood from kitchen fires, the bitter smoke rising from simple clay ovens where tortillas were pressed by hand. At dawn, roosters pierced the silence, their cries echoing off the mountainsides. Children ran barefoot along dirt paths, their laughter brief and light before returning to the endless chores that sustained fragile households. Poverty was not spoken of. It was simply the water they swam in, the sky they lived beneath. Among those children was Rafael. His world was one of scarcity, yet it was also one of stories. At night, the voices of elders drifted over courtyards, weaving corridos that celebrated men who had risen from nothing to become legends. These songs were not confined to radios or records. They were sung with conviction, carrying the weight of both pride and warning. Through them, young Rafael heard of men who dared to defy the limits of their birth, who turned the barren soil of Sinaloa into fields of power. The geography itself carried lessons. The mountains were unforgiving, the terrain isolating. Survival here required resourcefulness, the ability to read the land to find opportunity in places where none seemed to exist. Children learned early to recognize the difference between crops that could feed and crops that could enrich. In hushed tones, neighbors spoke of marijuana and poppy plants, of their strange allure, their promise of money that beans and corn could never provide. For a boy like Rafael, such whispers were not warnings, but possibilities. He grew up watching men return from the hills with pockets heavier than before, with clothes finer than their neighbors, with a confidence that poverty could never teach. He listened when the adults lowered their voices to speak of those who had traveled far beyond Badiraguato, carrying with them the harvest of forbidden crops. Though the dangers were immense, the rewards were intoxicating. As a child, Rafael knew hunger. He knew what it meant to look at the world and feel that it offered too little. Yet he also knew something else: ambition. It flickered within him, restless and unyielding. Where others saw inevitability, he saw an opening. He would not be confined by the boundaries of his birthplace. His barefoot days wandering the fields were filled with a strange duality. On one hand, the simplicity of rural life, the sound of insects buzzing in tall grass, the rhythm of machetes cutting through brush. On the other, the quiet spark of defiance growing inside him. That spark whispered of more than what his father's hands could earn, more than the narrow paths of Badiraguato. Caro Quintero was shaped as much by silence as by sound. He watched closely. He learned the way men carried themselves when they held authority. He absorbed the unspoken rules of respect and fear that governed small communities. And he came to understand something profound. In places where official power was absent, another kind of authority always emerged. It was not written in laws or decrees, but in the tilt of a head, the weight of a reputation. As he grew older, his curiosity shifted into calculation. He was no longer content to merely dream of something greater. He sought it. The illicit crops of Sinaloa were not abstract to him. They were tangible, living plants, swaying in the same winds that rustled the corn. Their presence was undeniable, their promise irresistible. The land had prepared him for this. The harshness of the mountains had carved resilience into him, teaching him to endure, to adapt, to survive where others faltered. The scarcity of his childhood had sharpened his hunger, making every opportunity gleam brighter. And the songs, the endless corridos that glorified those who walked the dangerous path, had given his ambition a soundtrack. It would be too simple to say that Rafael chose this life as one picks a road at a crossroads. In truth, the road was already carved beneath his feet. His choice was not whether to walk it, but how far along it he would dare to go. The soil of Badiraguato was fertile with poverty, but it was just as fertile with ambition. Generations had proven that from this land, men could emerge who would command nations' attention. For young Rafael, the question was not if, but when, as he gazed from the hillsides across valleys bathed in golden evening light, he must have felt both the beauty and the cruelty of his homeland. The same ridges that enclosed him also promised escape. The same isolation that kept his family poor also shielded the illicit fields that could change everything. And in that paradox, Rafael found his path. The boy who once walked barefoot on dusty paths was beginning to imagine himself in finer shoes, walking streets where fear bowed to him. His dreams stretched far beyond Badiraguato, but his roots, the dust, the corridos, the hunger would always remain with him. They were not weights to hold him back, but fuel for the fire that already burned. And so, in the quiet cradle of Sinaloa, beneath skies heavy with stars, Rafael Caro Quintero's journey began not with violence, not with grandeur, but with the simple, unyielding desire to escape the confines of his birth. By the time he left those mountains, he would no longer be just a boy of bad. He would be something else entirely, something the world was not yet ready to reckon with in the quiet stretch of the late 1970s. Mexico stood at a crossroads. The world around it was shifting, and in the shadows of its cities, a new kind of order was being assembled. It was not written in the laws of the state or the ink of constitutions. It was crafted in whispers, sealed with handshakes, and built upon the restless ambition of men who believed that power could be carved out of nothing but will. At the center of this gathering storm stood three figures who would, together, rewrite the meaning of organized crime in Mexico: Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, Ernesto Fonseca, Carrillo, and Rafael Caro Quintero. The Guadalajara Cartel did not emerge suddenly, like lightning striking the earth. It formed slowly, almost quietly, like rivers converging into something wider, deeper, and unstoppable. Each man brought with him a different thread, and together they wove an empire. Felix Gallardo, the godfather, was calm and calculating, a man who understood that brute force could only carry you so far. He dressed with elegance, spoke with measured authority, and carried himself like a statesman rather than a bandit. Ernesto Fonseca, Don Neto, was older, a figure of experience, someone who had weathered storms and knew the value of patience. And then there was Caro Quintero, young, daring, reckless at times, yet filled with the hunger of someone who refused to accept the life he was born into. Together, they did not merely create an organization. They created a syndicate that would stand as the beating heart of Mexican narcotics trafficking got in Guadalajara. Their power began to take shape. Mansions rose in neighborhoods once quiet, their walls tall and adorned with iron gates that concealed gardens and pools. Behind them, lavish haciendas stretched into the countryside, places where business and pleasure mingled seamlessly. The sound of laughter spilled across manicured lawns, but inside polished offices, the real work was done. Documents changed hands. Sums of money were calculated in silence, and deals were struck that would ripple far beyond the city. The cartel was not a gang of street criminals. It was an organization with vision, structure, and reach. It bridged the jungles of Colombia with the sprawling streets of the United States. At night, the hum of private planes could be heard on hidden airstrips carved out of farmland. Pilots guided their aircraft under the cover of darkness, their cargo sealed tight in compartments destined for distant markets. To the north, trucks crossed borders with practiced ease, each movement smoothed by the corruption that had already seeped into the veins of law enforcement. Money became its own kind of language. The rustle of dollar bills could be heard in bank offices, in briefcases carried across hotel lobbies, and in the quiet exchanges that took place in backrooms. American dollars, Colombian pesos, Mexican pesos, all flowing into a current so vast it blurred the line between legal and illicit. With each transaction, the cartel grew stronger, more daring, more certain of its hold on the future. But what truly defined the Guadalajara Cartel was not just its wealth, nor the scope of its trade. It was the intoxicating psychology of power. For Caro Quintero, still in his 20s, it was as though he had been handed the keys to a kingdom. The boy who had once walked barefoot through the fields of Badiraguato now commanded a fortune, an army, and a reputation that stretched across borders. He was no longer a farmer's son. He was a man shaping history, if only in shadows. There was a seduction in that rise, to build something vast, to see it grow beyond imagination, to stand at the center of networks that stretched thousands of miles. It carried with it an illusion of control. The meetings, the planes, the haciendas, the endless flow of money, they created a rhythm, a pulse, a sense that nothing could challenge them. Power can often feel eternal to those who wield it, even when history tells us it never is. The expansion was not without risk. Every decision was a gamble. A misstep could draw attention. A single betrayal could unravel years of work. Yet in those years, the Guadalajara Cartel seemed untouchable. They operated not in the shadows alone, but often in plain sight, shielded by bribes and connections that reached into the very institutions meant to stop them. Officials turned their heads. Judges hesitated. Policemen looked the other way. It was as if the cartel existed in a parallel Mexico one, where their rules quietly overruled the law of the state. The cartel's gatherings were scenes of contrasts. In one moment, the polished setting of a hacienda dinner, chandeliers casting soft light across silver cutlery, fine wines poured into delicate glasses, laughter echoing under painted ceilings. In the next, hushed conversations in back rooms, maps unfurled on tables, routes traced with steady fingers, and the drone of strategy laid out in meticulous detail. The sound of propellers filled the night air, a constant reminder of the lifeblood of their empire. The faint roar of engines fading into the horizon was, for them, the sound of progress. And yet, beneath the wealth and organization, something darker stirred. Ambition, like a fire, never rests. It feeds on itself, hungers for more, and pushes men beyond reason. For Rafael, the empire was not enough. He carried within him the boldness of youth, the desire not merely to succeed but to dominate. He believed he could bend fate to his will, and in that belief, seeds were planted that would later grow into both triumph and tragedy. The Guadalajara Cartel was in many ways a masterpiece of its kind. It showed what could be built when ambition, organization, and opportunity collided. But masterpieces can also become monuments to hubris. And even as the cartel stood at the height of its power, shadows lengthened on the horizon. Enemies were watching. Governments were calculating. And the men who once believed themselves untouchable were already standing on fragile ground by the early 1980s. The Guadalajara Cartel was no longer just a story whispered in cantinas or written in the quiet ledgers of banks. It was a force that governments could not ignore, a network so vast that it threatened to eclipse everything before it. And yet, the very scale of its success made it vulnerable. As this chapter closes, we leave behind the image of a cartel at its zenith, the grand hacienda, the hum of night flights, the endless flow of money, and the intoxicating belief in their own invincibility. But the question remains, how long can such an empire stand before the weight of its own ambition begins to crack its foundation? By the middle of the 1980s, the empire of the Guadalajara Cartel had grown too large, too visible, to be dismissed as a distant concern. What had once been whispers in cantinas and coded signals in the night air had turned into something else entirely. A vast current of narcotics flowing steadily north, shaping the streets of Los Angeles, San Diego, and Chicago. The United States could no longer pretend that this was Mexico's problem alone. The weight of the cartel's ambition now pressed directly against American borders, and the response was inevitable. The Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA, began to take Mexico more seriously than ever before. Their offices, scattered across dusty cities and guarded by chain-link fences, became the staging grounds of a struggle that was as much about patience as it was about courage. This was not a war fought openly with battalions and tanks. It was a quieter war, waged in shadows, in the folds of files and the smudge of fingerprints, in endless phone records and names scribbled into notebooks. And into this war stepped Enrique, known to friends and colleagues simply as Kiki. He was not a man of grand gestures or theatrical speeches. He was quiet, deliberate, and deeply committed to his work. Born in Mexico and raised in California, Camarena carried within him a rare duality, the ability to understand the culture he was investigating, while also believing in the mission of the agency he served. His presence in Guadalajara was unassuming, but behind his calm eyes lived a dedication that would one day place him at the heart of history. Kiki's work was not glamorous. It rarely is for those who serve in silence. His days were spent in cramped offices where the air was thick with cigarette smoke and the hum of typewriters never ceased. Maps of Mexico, dotted with pins and scribbles, hung on the walls. Coffee cooled in forgotten cups, while stacks of case files grew taller each week. Outside, the city of Guadalajara pulsed with life cantinas, alive with music. Markets filled with the smell of roasted meat and fresh fruit, but inside the DEA's world, the mood was different. It was the mood of men and women who knew they were being watched even as they watched others. Camarena's investigations began like threads. A contact in a bar who spoke too freely, a shipment that went missing at the border, a sudden spike in wealth in a town that had always been poor. Each detail on its own meant little, but to Kiki, patience was everything. He tugged at those threads, one by one, weaving them into a pattern that slowly began to reveal the true scale of the Guadalajara Cartel's reach. Surveillance became his constant companion. Long hours in cars parked on quiet streets, the windows cracked open just enough to let in the warm air. He memorized license plates, faces, patterns of movement. He noticed who arrived at the haciendas, who left in the middle of the night, which phone numbers appeared too often on ledgers. The work was monotonous, exhausting, and fraught with danger. For every glance he cast into the shadows was a risk that the shadows might glance back. The cartel, meanwhile, began to sense a shift. They were men accustomed to bribes smoothing the way, two officials looking elsewhere, two journalists silenced before their words reached print. But the presence of the D in Guadalajara felt different. It was quiet, persistent, and relentless. The cartel leaders, Felix Gallardo with his calm authority, Don Neto with his caution, and Caro Quintero with his fiery boldness, could feel the invisible walls tightening around them, and it bred something they had not known in years: unease. Meetings grew more cautious. Phone calls became shorter, voices lowered, words coded. Guards lingered longer at gates, watching the streets with suspicion. In their grand haciendas, the laughter at dinner tables was accompanied by a silent undertow of paranoia. For power, no matter how vast, is fragile when exposed to the possibility of collapse. Camarena moved carefully, fully aware of the danger. He knew the men he followed were not ordinary criminals, but architects of an empire. They commanded fortunes, armies, and influence that stretched into government offices. One wrong move could mean not just the end of an investigation, but the end of his life. Yet he pressed on, because he believed that truth had to be pursued. No matter the risk, in the dusty hallways of the DO offices, he was known for his steadiness. He was not reckless, nor was he naive. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who understood the stakes but refused to let fear dictate his path. He worked late into the evenings, often leaving the office with his notes tucked under his arm, the fading sun casting long shadows across the city. At home, his family waited, unaware of just how deeply he was threading himself into the most dangerous story Mexico had ever written. As the months passed, the tension in Guadalajara became palpable. The cartel leaders, once basking in their untouchable power, began to whisper about a man who was watching too closely, listening too carefully. They did not yet know his name, but they felt his presence. And presence, in their world, was enough to inspire dread. For Caro Quintero, the unease struck deeply. He was young, ambitious, and accustomed to believing he could outwit anyone. Yet he could not escape the feeling that someone was following the lines of his empire, tracing them with steady patience, waiting for the moment to strike. It was not a gun or a rival that unsettled him. Most it was the persistence of a quiet man in a smoke-filled office, armed only with a pen, a file, and the conviction that no empire was beyond reach. The mid-1980s, in Guadalajara, were years of dual realities. By day, the city lived and breathed with its usual rhythm. Children played in plazas. Vendors sold their wares, music drifted into the night. But in the undercurrent, another rhythm beat steadily, the rhythm of suspicion, of footsteps in alleyways, of eyes watching from parked cars. The DEA's presence was no longer background noise. It was the faint tightening of a noose. And in this tightening circle, two forces inched closer to one another: the unchecked empire of the Guadalajara Cartel and the quiet persistence of Enrique. They were bound by destiny, moving toward a collision that neither could yet see fully, but both could sense in their own way. For one, it was the pursuit of truth. For the other, the fight to preserve an illusion of invincibility. As this chapter draws to a close, the stage is set. The city hums with life, but beneath the surface, tension coils like a spring. In one corner, the cartel watches with unease. In another, Camarena watches with determination. The collision is inevitable, and history will remember it not as a clash of equals, but as the moment when shadows met a man who refused to look away. The afternoon air in Guadalajara carried a weight that seemed almost unnatural, as though the city itself was holding its breath. The sun lingered high, washing the streets in a heavy golden light, and the sound of traffic hummed in the distance, a steady rhythm of everyday life. People moved about their business, vendors calling out their wares, children darting between stalls, the faint clatter of a bicycle chain turning. For most, it was an ordinary day. But for one man, the seconds ticking away would mark the end of everything he knew. Enrique "Kiki" Camarena stepped out of his office with the unassuming composure of a man who believed he still had time. He was 37 years old, a husband, a father, and an agent whose relentless pursuit of truth had drawn dangerous attention. The air smelled faintly of dust and gasoline, mingling with the scent of roasted corn from a nearby street vendor. He adjusted his tie, the simple gesture of someone preparing to leave one world and unknowingly step into another. There is a certain silence that arrives before disaster. A silence not of absence, but of weight. The streets seemed to fall into that hush as Kiki walked toward his car. He was alone, though not entirely unwatched. For days, shadows had been moving just beyond his sight eyes, tracking his movements, minds calculating the right moment to strike. And now it had come. From the corner of the street, A vehicle slowed, its engine low and deliberate. Another followed, their presence casual enough to be ignored by anyone not looking too closely. Doors opened with an ease that belied the violence about to unfold. Men stepped out, their shoes scraping against the pavement. Polished leather, scuffed soles, the faint rhythm of approaching certainty. Kiki noticed them only when they were too close. The air shifted, charged with intent. He turned, confusion flickering across his face, quickly replaced by something sharper, realization. Perhaps in that moment he understood the cost of his work, the weight of every field burned, every warehouse raided, every whispered secret he had pulled into the light. He had struck at an empire, and now the empire struck back. The men moved with precision, practiced and cold. Voices rose firm, commanding, but not shouted. There was no need for spectacle. One reached for him, and the struggle began. Shoes scuffed against stone, a brief clash of resistance. The smell of sweat and gasoline thickened in the air. Nearby, a woman paused at a storefront, her eyes catching the scene but not daring to linger. People looked away. The silence of complicity was louder than any cry for help. And then, just as quickly as it began, the street fell still again. Kiki was forced into the waiting vehicle, swallowed by shadows and steel. The door slammed shut with a metallic finality, and the cars pulled away, leaving only the faint trail of exhaust and the echo of footsteps fading into nothing. For the city, life continued. The vendors kept calling, the traffic resumed its rhythm, children still darted between stalls, but an absence had been carved into the air, one that could not be seen but would soon be felt across continents for Rafael Caro Quintero. This was more than an abduction, it was a declaration. He had grown restless, consumed by a paranoia that matched his arrogance. To him, Kiki Camarena was not just a man. He was a symbol, a thorn embedded deep within the skin of his empire. Each action Kiki took had exposed more, had burned closer to the heart of Caro's wealth and influence. Removing him was not only retaliation, it was a demonstration of power in Caro's mind. This single act would reset the balance. The D had overstepped. Foreign agents had dared to dictate the terms of his dominion, and he would show them the cost. He believed, with the certainty of men blinded by their own grandeur, that taking Camarena would preserve his empire, that by silencing one man, he could silence an entire government's will. But power has its illusions, and Caro failed to see the storm he was summoning. Every empire that builds itself upon fear forgets that fear also spreads outward, igniting resolve in those who refuse to bow to it. Kiki's abduction was not a quiet disappearance. It was the sounding of a bell that could not be unrung. Back in the DI offices, hours would pass before the unease hardened into panic. Calls unanswered. A man not arriving where he was expected to be. At first, there might have been rational explanations, meeting delayed, a detour taken. But with each hour, the dread deepened, until the truth could no longer be denied. Camarena had vanished, and in that void lay the weight of something unthinkable for his family. The absence was sharper, crueler. The empty chair at the dinner table, the silence of a phone that would not ring. They did not yet know the details, but they felt the rupture instantly. The ordinary rhythms of life, the sound of keys at the door, the laughter in the evening were gone, and in their place, only questions. On the streets of Guadalajara, whispers began to spread. Some claimed to have seen the cars, others swore they heard a struggle, but no one stepped forward with certainty. Fear clouded memory, blurred details, silenced voices, In a city where the cartel's shadow loomed so heavily, truth became something dangerous to hold. And yet, history would remember this moment not as silence, but as ignition. The abduction of Kiki Camarena was the crossing of a line that even the boldest cartels had not dared to approach. It was more than an attack on one man, it was an affront to an entire nation's resolve. The DEA would not retreat quietly, nor would the United States forget, but in the stillness of that golden afternoon, as the cars carried Kiki away, none of that was yet certain. What remained was only the quiet aftermath of violence, the smell of exhaust, the scrape of shoes now gone, the echo of absence lingering in the air. History often hinges on moments that, at the time, appeared deceptively ordinary. A man leaving his office, a street bathed in sunlight, a handful of cars pulling quietly to the curb. Yet from these fragments, entire storms are born, and in this moment, one man's disappearance became the spark that would consume empires. Grief has a sound. It is the low murmur of a gathering crowd, the shuffling of feet on cold stone, the brittle crackle of candle flames trembling in the evening air. In Mexico and far beyond, the disappearance and death of Enrique Kiki Camarena was not merely a story carried by the newspapers. It was a rupture in the shared consciousness of two nations. The first reports were hesitant, shaded with uncertainty. A missing man, an American agent who had vanished into the labyrinth of Guadalajara. Days passed, and the silence grew heavier. Then the confirmation came, whispers hardened into truth. Camarena was gone, and what had been done to him was unspeakable. The nation exhaled in shock, and across the border in the United States, outrage burned into grief. Newspapers carried the headlines in bold, uncompromising ink. Black letters stretched across white pages like wounds that could not be ignored. Photographs of Camarena, smiling and alive, stared back at millions of readers who now knew his face not as an agent working in the shadows, but as a martyr whose death had laid bare the cruelty of the cartel world. In Washington, words of outrage filled the air. Politicians spoke with solemn voices, promising justice, demanding accountability. Behind closed doors, tempers rose. The abduction and murder of an American agent was not only a crime, it was a challenge. A direct strike at the authority of a nation that prided itself on strength. For the DEA, it was more personal still. His colleagues felt the weight in ways too deep for public speeches. They remembered the man, not the symbol. The laughter in the office halls, the determination in his voice when a lead surfaced, the quiet moments when he spoke of his family waiting for him at home. And now, all of it was memory. Agents who had once worked side by side with him carried the guilt of survival, the ache of knowing he had been taken, and they had been left behind. Their grief did not weaken them. It hardened into something sharp, unyielding. A vow whispered in silence, "This will not be forgotten," across Mexico. Candlelight vigils bloomed like constellations on the ground. Mothers held their children close. Men bowed their heads. Prayers rose into the night. There was sorrow, yes, but also unease. Because beneath the mourning lay a question too dangerous to voice aloud. If such a man could be taken, who was safe? In the villages and barrios where the cartel's shadow stretched, the message was clear. The empire that had long been feared had crossed a boundary so bold, so reckless, that even its followers began to feel the tremor of dread. Rafael Caro Quintero had built his world on confidence, on the illusion of untouchable power. But illusions, once cracked, never mend the same way. What he had intended as a display of dominance now revealed itself as folly. The killing of Kiki Camarena was not the silencing of a threat, it was the unmasking of a regime. The Mexican government, cornered by the weight of international fury, found itself unable to maintain the silence it had so often used as a shield. Pressure from the United States was unrelenting. Phone calls flew between capitals, words wrapped in diplomacy but sharpened with accusation. Mexico had long balanced its sovereignty against the growing influence of its northern neighbor, but now it was forced to confront a reality it could no longer deflect. The investigation was more than an administrative act. It became a theater of nations, every move scrutinized, every gesture measured for sincerity. Mexican officials walked a line between appeasement and pride, while American agents, fueled by grief, demanded nothing short of justice. The air was thick with suspicions of corruption, of complicity, of doors left unlocked and eyes turned away in the streets. The people whispered what officials could not say aloud, that the cartels had grown too powerful, their reach too deep, their influence too pervasive. That this death was not only a tragedy, but a mirror held up to the state itself, reflecting the rot that had been allowed to spread. And yet, amid the mourning, something else stirred. Resolve, the kind of resolve that rises not from victory, but from loss, too profound to endure passively. Kiki Camarena had not lived a life of glory or spectacle. He had lived a life of quiet work, of diligence, of conviction. His death, brutal as it was, gave those qualities a resonance that could not be silenced. For the DEA, his name became a rallying cry. Operations once bound by caution now pressed forward with renewed fire. Agents carried his memory with them into every raid, every investigation, as though by their persistence they could carve meaning out of loss. For the cartel, the fear was different. Whispers spread in their own circles, where power had once seemed unshakable. If killing Camarena had been a triumph, why did it feel like the beginning of collapse? Caro Quintero's lieutenants saw the change in his eyes, the flicker of unease behind arrogance. He had pulled the world's gaze directly upon himself, and even his wealth and connections could not dim its glare. The psychology of power is fragile. It feeds on belief, the belief of followers, of communities too frightened to resist, of governments willing to look away. But when a single act exposes the cruelty at its core, belief fractures. And when it fractures, power trembles. As nights passed and candles burned down to pools of wax, the silence of mourning gave way to the murmur of determination. Kiki's death had shaken nations not because he was the first to fall, but because his story revealed too much. It revealed the brutality of the cartel, the fragility of governments, the peril faced by those who dared to confront both. In that revelation lay the beginning of change. It was not swift, nor was it simple, but it was inevitable. The chapter closes not with resolution, but with the weight of a question that hung in the air like smoke. How many lives would yet be consumed in the storm unleashed by this single death? When a man commits an act that shakes nations, the silence that follows does not last long. In the weeks after the death of Enrique Kiki Camarena, Rafael Caro Quintero found the world he had built begin to contract, folding in on itself with every passing day. What once felt infinite haciendas, with walls high as fortresses, airstrips cutting into the desert, and an empire stretching from Colombia to California now felt fragile, unstable, and perilously exposed. The hunt began quietly, almost imperceptibly at first. A phone call that was no longer returned, a trusted associate who kept his distance. A rumor whispered in the back of a cantina that carried a little too far. For Caro Quintero, the first warning signs were not the helicopters overhead or the agents gathering on foreign soil. They were the small betrayals, the subtle shifts in loyalty. The realization that those who had once thrived in his shadow were now afraid to be caught in his light. The DEA, humiliated and enraged, poured everything into the pursuit. Files spread across desks, maps marked with pins, photographs of haciendas pinned beside faces of men whose names once meant little, but now carried the weight of international priority. In Mexico, the government, under suffocating pressure, moved with urgency it had long resisted. Agents who once moved cautiously now carried themselves with the weight of inevitability. Caro Quintero, for all his pride, was not blind. He felt it in the air, the tension that hummed in the walls of his safe houses, the nervous glances of bodyguards whose loyalty was no longer certain, the silence that settled in corridors that once echoed with laughter and music. A fugitive does not need to be told he is being hunted. He can taste it, sharp and metallic, in every breath. Nights became restless, in the stillness of dark rooms. He listened not to the sound of his own breathing, but to the world outside, the distant bark of dogs, the faint hum of engines where none should be, the soft crunch of boots pressing into earth. He had lived a life of command, but now he was reduced to waiting, to imagining threats before they arrived, to pacing floors with the weight of inevitability pressing on his chest. Helicopters swept across the skies, searchlights slicing through the blackness. The land itself seemed hostile now, every shadow a possible betrayal, every open road a trap. The cartel that had once felt like an empire without end was shrinking, reduced to a few scattered hideouts, the walls of which seemed thinner with every hour. And yet there was still arrogance within him. He was not an ordinary fugitive. He was Rafael Caro Quintero, the man who had built fields of marijuana so vast they were visible from the sky. The man who had crafted alliances that stretched across oceans. Even as fear gnawed at the edges of his pride, he carried himself with defiance. To admit defeat was unthinkable. To be caught was unacceptable. Pride and dread wrestled in his mind, each rising and falling like waves against jagged rock. Meanwhile, the net closed tighter. The DEA's pursuit was not only about justice, it was about redemption. The killing of Camarena had been a wound to their honor, a scar to their credibility. Every step of the hunt carried with it not just the weight of duty, but the fury of betrayal. They could not, would not, allow his killers to remain free. The pace quickened. Safe houses were raided. Informants whispered. Every passage through a quiet street, every crossing at a rural checkpoint, every movement through the countryside was watched, noted, remembered. The walls of Mexico itself seemed to move, closing in, narrowing the possibilities of escape. For Caro Quintero, the psychological toll deepened. Restless nights turned into anxious days. Meals went untouched. Conversations shortened to whispers, eyes darting at every sound. A man who once exuded the calm assurance of empire now lived in the twitch of nerves, the constant weighing of risk against survival. Pride remained, but it was a hollow pride, cracked by the knowledge that he was no longer the hunter but the hunted. The landscape mirrored his unraveling. Dust rose in clouds along dirt roads as convoys moved in secrecy. The air carried the smell of gasoline, of sweat, of tension so sharp it left a taste on the tongue. In villages and cities alike, people watched silently, aware that history was moving around them but powerless to intervene. Some whispered of justice, others of fear. All knew that a reckoning was near. Betrayal came not in grand gestures, but in small, quiet choices. A friend who hesitated too long, a cousin who spoke under pressure, a guard who vanished into the night, leaving behind nothing but an empty chair and a door left ajar. These moments, individually small, accumulated into inevitability. A man can build walls of stone and steel, but when loyalty falters, those walls collapse like sand, and so the hunt, relentless and unyielding, became more than the pursuit of a man. It became a study in unraveling, a portrait of power crumbling under the weight of its own arrogance, a reminder that every empire, no matter how grand, carries within it the seeds of its own destruction. By the time the footsteps came, the crunch of boots in the night, the echo of orders shouted in urgent tones, Quintero must have known it was only a matter of when, not if. He had lived long enough to understand that power is not lost in a single instant, but in a series of moments, each one chipping away at certainty until only dread remains. The hunt had begun as vengeance. It had grown into a mission, but for those who lived it, for the fugitive, for the agents, for the silent watchers in villages and cities, it was something more elemental. It was the stripping away of illusion, the slow, inevitable collapse of a myth that had once seemed indestructible, and as dawns and dusks blurred together in the tightening grip of pursuit, one truth lingered in the air, heavy as the scent of smoke after fire. No man, no matter how powerful, can outrun the shadows forever. The air was heavy that evening in Costa Rica. A blanket of humidity pressed down on the city of Alajuela, clinging to every surface like a second skin. It was April of 1985, and the rainy season had begun its slow arrival. The sky, swollen with clouds, threatened to break open at any moment, releasing the kind of storm that sweeps through the tropics with sudden violence. The streets were damp, the smell of wet earth and exhaust mingling in the air, and in a quiet corner of this foreign land, a man who once believed himself untouchable waited for the inevitable knock at his door. Rafael Caro Quintero, the face of power and arrogance in Mexico just months before, was no longer a king in exile. He was reduced to a fugitive, his kingdom fractured, his fortune of little use, his name carrying more weight as a target than as a shield. For weeks he had lived like a ghost, moving from safe house to safe house, always chased by the same thought, that the world he built in Sinaloa had collapsed faster than he ever imagined. The man who once walked into Guadalajara's most luxurious restaurants without fear now avoided windows, now glanced at shadows. Even the sound of children playing outside made his stomach tighten because laughter, innocent as it was, could mean witnesses, and witnesses meant eyes, and eyes could mean betrayal. On the morning of his arrest, the air was thick with the scent of rain-soaked hibiscus and gasoline. Caro Quintero sat in a borrowed home, restless, pacing slowly across tiled floors. He knew the walls were closing in. Rumors reached him like whispers carried on the wind. The Americans wanted him. The Mexicans wanted him. Rivals wanted him. Even those once loyal, who swore by his name, wanted him. And in the silence between his footsteps, he could hear the truth he had tried to bury. There was no one left to trust. When the knock finally came, it was not a thunderous crash, but a measured rap, 3 short knocks, then stillness. Caro froze. For a moment he convinced himself it might be nothing, just a neighbor, a delivery, the ordinary pulse of life. But then came the second round of knocks, firmer this time, followed by the unmistakable shuffle of boots in the corridor. The door opened, and in that instant, time seemed to slow. A dozen armed men poured into the room, their presence filling the air with authority. The clicking of handcuffs echoed like iron bells. Caro did not resist. Perhaps he knew resistance would be meaningless, or perhaps he was simply too tired to fight anymore. His hands, once used to signing deals worth millions, were drawn together in chains. The metal was cold against his skin. It was not pain that passed through him then, but something heavier, the weight of realization. He was no longer a kingpin. He was a prisoner. Outside, the tropical rain began to fall in sheets, smearing the world in grey. Journalists would later describe his arrest as a triumph of justice, a victory for the DEA and for Mexico, but the scene itself held no triumph. There were no celebrations, no cheers in the streets. Only the sound of rainfall on tin roofs, only the shuffle of boots carrying him away, only the quiet murmurs of neighbors watching from behind curtains. Asterisk for Caro, the moment carried a cruel irony. In Guadalajara, he had commanded armies of men, bribed governors, and walked with the arrogance of someone who believed he owned the future. Yet here he was, captured not in some cinematic gunfight, but in a quiet house in a foreign land. Betrayed not by bullets, but by inevitability. The empire he had built crumbled in silence, and all the violence, all the fear, all the power he once wielded meant nothing in the face of a door being opened and chains being fastened. Inside his mind, memories must have flickered like candlelight. The fields of marijuana stretching endlessly in the Sinaloan sun. The nights of celebration with music, women, and whiskey. The whispers of respect, the fear in men's eyes when he entered a room. And then, just as quickly, the darker images, the interrogations, the screams that would never be forgotten, the face of Enrique Kiki, the DEA agent whose disappearance had ignited a fire that consumed everything Caro had built, for all the power he once held. The downfall arrived with a simplicity that felt cruel. No grandeur, no dramagist, the slow unraveling of a man who believed himself immortal. His capture sent ripples through the world he left behind. In Mexico, whispers turned to tremors as cartels shifted their alliances. Rivals rose quickly to seize the ground he had abandoned. The balance of power began to tilt, setting the stage for an even bloodier era in the years to come. The Guadalajara Cartel, once the giant of the drug trade, began to fracture. Out of its bones would rise new names, men like Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, Amado Carrillo Fuentes, and others who would inherit the chaos. Caro's arrest was not the end of the war on drugs. It was merely a pivot, a hinge upon which the story turned. And though he sat in chains, the machinery of the trade did not stop. It shifted, it evolved, it grew even more ruthless. Asterisk that night in Costa Rica. As Caro was flown away under guard, the rain did not stop. It fell endlessly, a curtain of water washing over streets and rooftops, as though the heavens themselves sought to cleanse the air. But no rain could wash away the memory of his empire, nor the fear that lingered in the minds of those who once lived under his shadow. For Rafael Caro Quintero, the fall was sudden and absolute. Yet for Mexico, it was only the beginning of another, darker chapter. And so the story pauses here. On that rain-slicked nighter, Kingpin carried away in silence, the echo of chains marking the end of an era. But history has a way of filling voids. Power never remains vacant for long, and in the hollow left by his downfall, New forces were already stirring, waiting to rise. Prison is not only made of walls and bars. It is also built of silence, of passing years, of the slow erosion of a man's confidence until only fragments of his former self remain. For Rafael Caro Quintero, the man once feared across Mexico, captivity was a paradox. His body was locked away, yet his name, his myth traveled further than ever before. Inside the penitentiary, the world was reduced to concrete cells, barred windows, and the rhythmic routine of confinement. The smell of bleach and sweat clung to the corridors. At night, the air was heavy with whisper snatches of songs, half-remembered prayers, and the low murmur of men reliving their pasts. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into years. Seasons changed outside, but inside, time seemed to move differently, as if it was stretching endlessly across the same narrow spaces. Yet beyond those walls, the legend of Caro Quintero grew. Corridos, folk ballads of crime and power, carried his name across dusty towns and crowded cantinas. Singers painted him as a figure larger than life, a man who had challenged both nations and survived. Children grew up hearing his story like a cautionary tale wrapped in fascination. For the poor, he was remembered by some as a generous figure, the man who once handed out money in villages. For others, he was nothing more than a criminal whose arrogance destroyed lives. In prison, he could do little but listen. News arrived in fragments, whispers from guards. Newspapers passed hand to hand. He heard of the fall of the Guadalajara Cartel, of the rise of new names: Guzman, Carrillo Fuentes, the Orellano, Felix brothers. He watched as generations shifted, as the empire he once helped build splintered into rival factions. The trade did not die with his capture. It evolved, multiplied, became bloodier than ever. He was locked away, but the machine rolled on. The paradox gnawed at him. His downfall had been swift, yet his name refused to fade. Even as younger, hungrier men seized power, the shadow of his story remained. He had become a symbol, for better or worse, an icon of Mexico's drug war. A cautionary ghost haunting every new kingpin who dared to rise. Years turned into decades. The black of his hair gave way to grey, the sharpness of his eyes softened by age. The man who once lived at full speed, always calculating, always commanding, now moved with the slowness of confinement. Yet deep inside, there remained something unbroken, a flicker of pride, perhaps, or the stubborn belief that his story was not yet finished. Then, in 2013, the unimaginable happened. After nearly 3 decades behind bars, Caro Quintero was suddenly released. The reason? A legal technicality, a decision by a Mexican court that his original trial had been mishandled. It was a moment that stunned the world. Officials scrambled, outrage filled headlines, and whispers of conspiracy spread like wildfire. How could one of the most infamous names in Mexico simply walk free? The day of his release was surreal. Caro emerged older, weathered by time, but still carrying that aura of quiet menace. Photographs captured him in simple clothes, his face marked by years of captivity, yet his presence still radiating something more than the ordinary. It was as if history itself had stepped out of the past and back into the present. For some, his release was a nightmare, a reminder of a violent chapter they had tried to forget. For others, it was almost mythic, the return of a figure long spoken of, but rarely seen. In the borderlands and the mountains of Sinaloa, his name stirred again in songs and in whispers, as if the old world had suddenly collided with the new. The timing carried its own weight. By 2013, Mexico's drug war had transformed into a conflict of staggering brutality. Cartels were no longer the tightly controlled organizations of his youth. They had splintered into rival armies, each more ruthless than the last. Streets were stained with violence, cities lived under fear, and the government's war against the cartels had become an endless spiral. Into this chaos stepped Caro Quintero, man out of time, a relic of an earlier age, yet one whose shadow still stretched across the present. Was he returning to reclaim influence? Or had the world moved on without him, leaving him to wander like a ghost in a landscape he no longer recognized? Nobody knew, and that uncertainty was more haunting than any act of violence. The legend of Caro Quintero had survived prison. Now, free again, it began to grow in new directions. Rumors filled the silent sightings in the mountains. Whispers of protection by old allies, speculation of his hand in new conflicts. Authorities scrambled to track him, yet he seemed to slip through their grasp like smoke. For the ordinary people of Mexico, his release was both distant and close. Distant, because most would never see him. Close, because his story was etched into the very fabric of the drug war that touched every community. He was a reminder that the past was never really past, that the ghosts of old cartels still lingered, shaping the violence of the present as he stepped back into freedom, older but unbroken. The question was not simply what Caro Quintero would do next. The deeper question was what his return revealed about Mexico itself, about the fragility of justice, about the endurance of corruption, about the way myths outlive the men who inspire them. By the close of this chapter, one thing is clear. Prison may have confined Rafael Caro Quintero's body, but it never contained his shadow. His release did not end his story. It simply reminded the world that he still belonged to it. And so the figure who once fell in chains walked again in silence, carrying the weight of decades, stepping back into a world that had not forgotten his name. Asterisk. Freedom for Rafael Caro Quintero was never truly free. It was shadowed by pursuit, haunted by the gaze of nations, and marked by the weight of a name that would not fade. When he walked out of prison in 2013, many wondered whether he would disappear quietly into the mountains, an aging relic of a darker age. But the world had other plans. Within weeks, his name was once again etched onto the walls of history, not as a forgotten figure, but as one of the most wanted men alive. The United States Drug Enforcement Administration, the same institution that had once mourned the death of Enrique Kiki, placed Caro Quintero at the top of its fugitive list. His photograph stared out from posters and digital screens, a face older now, but unmistakable. The reward for his capture soared to $20 million, one of the highest bounties ever placed on a single man. In towns across Mexico, whispers began to stir. Sightings here, rumors there, a convoy of trucks slipping through mountain passes, a figure glimpsed in the shadows of some said he lived like a phantom, hidden deep in the Sierras where government reach faltered and loyalty still bought silence. Others claimed he had become untouchable once more, guarded by alliances that stretched back decades, but the truth remained elusive. He was no longer the young kingpin who once ruled Guadalajara with arrogance and swagger. Time had bent him, weathered him, and perhaps even humbled him. And yet, in the eyes of the DEA, he was more than a man. He was a symbol, the unfinished chapter of Camarina's story, the embodiment of defiance against justice that demanded closure. The irony was sharp. For all the resources poured into hunting him, Caro Quintero seemed less a fugitive of flesh and blood, and more a ghost always, near yet never within reach. Reports surfaced of raids that came too late, of compounds left abandoned only hours before arrival, of networks unraveling into silence whenever his name was spoken. The hunt became not only about capturing him, but about chasing the very idea of him. In this final stretch of his story, the psychology shifts again. No longer the young lion of Guadalajara, no longer the imprisoned legend of corridos. He became something more spectral, a man defined as much by absence as by presence. To the DEA, he was an obsession. To the Mexican state, a thorn in the side of international credibility. To the cartels of the present, he was both ancestor and ghost, a figure whose myth outlived his influence. And to the people, he remained complicated. For some in the rural mountains, he was remembered with a strange loyalty, a benefactor of another time. For others, especially those touched by the violence of the drug trade, his name was only another reminder of suffering, of corruption, of lives shattered in the wake of empire. The story of Caro Quintero does not end neatly, because in truth, it has not ended at all. Each poster, each press release, each whispered corrido suggests that the cycle continues, power shifting from one name to another, each man believing he will outrun the fate that waits in the shadows. But history tells a different story. Empires collapse, fugitives fall, and legends eventually fade into silence. And yet, silence is not the same as peace. The corridors of power in Mexico still tremble with the aftershocks of his generation. The drug war rages on, more violent, more fragmented, more unpredictable than in the days of Guadalajara. Where once there was one cartel, now there are many, each carving territories, each spilling blood in pursuit of the same crown that once sat upon his head. The figure of Caro Quintero reminds us not of victory or defeat, but of continuity, the unbroken chain of ambition and violence that binds one era to the next. So what do we make of this man? Now called the DEA's most wanted, now a shadow who lingers at the edges of maps and headlines. Perhaps the more important question is not about him at all, but about us. Why do such figures captivate us? Why does the myth outlive the man? Is it the allure of defiance, the audacity of one who once stood against nations? Or is it the darker truth that power, in whatever form it takes, leaves a trace that cannot be erased? In the end, Caro Quintero's story is unresolved, like a corrido that fades before its final verse. He exists between worlds, past and present, freedom and capture, legend and man. His face still stares from wanted posters. His name still circulates in intelligence reports. His ghost still drifts through the Sierras. And yet, no matter how the story concludes, whether with capture, with death, or with disappearance, shadow will remain. Because Rafael Caro Quintero is not only one man. He is a reflection of the cycles that continue to shape Mexico's history. He is a symbol of how far ambition can reach, and how deeply it can scar. The chapter closes not with triumph, nor with justice neatly served, but with silence, the silence of questions that have no easy answers. What drives men to such lives? Why does power demand such sacrifice? And can a nation ever escape the legacies of those who carved their names into its soil with blood and fear? Perhaps the story will never find its ending. Perhaps it is meant to linger, like the final echo of a guitar chord, fading into the night. And so, as the corridos continue to sing, as posters continue to fade on city walls, The figure of Rafael Caro Quintero remains wanted, unseen and unfinished. A ghost of history still walking